Liberal MP Julian Simmonds from the Labor Party, Julian Hill. Thanks both for your time, gentlemen. If I can start with you, Julian Hill. COVID zero, this aim for this in Victoria. We know Daniel Andrews said, we'll go hard, we'll go early. It's the only way to get Delta back to zero. Is that fight done, though? Is getting Delta to zero in big cities just about impossible?
Well, Victoria's done it before. We did it last year in terms of beating that terrible earlier wave. And we haven't thrown in the towel yet. Daniel Andrews, though, was very clear, I think, with Victorians a week or so ago. We're in a precarious situation. We were close to losing control of this thing. But you can say one thing about Daniel. There's no ambiguity about the goal to get those cases down to zero and restore community life to end the lockdowns. Time will tell how we'll go, but there's no mixed messages. There's no mixed public health messages. And frankly, I'd much rather be in Victoria's situation now than the mess we've seen in New South Wales with confusing public health restrictions, too slow to act. But both states, sadly, are vulnerable to more of these lockdowns. I call them Scott Morrison's lockdowns, because let's be clear, we're in this mess because we did not have a safe national quarantine system and we don't have enough vaccines.
When does this, determination and single-mindedness from Daniel Andrews become stubbornness? I mean, there has to be a point at which he reviews COVID zero and says, well, instead of that, here's a version of lockdown, a much lighter one we can live with until November that helps people get a semblance of life and doesn't overwhelm hospitals.
Well, you've only got to have a look at what's happening in New South Wales right now. We've had more than 1,000 cases for the last 2 days. That's the trajectory which any state that lets this get out of control, while our population is vulnerable and unvaccinated, is taking. I mean, it's all
so
very
you just
well
say go for COVID zero all the way
don't we lift lockdowns
through? Is that what you're saying?
No, well, obviously the state government's taking advice, and their health advice right now, Daniel's been upfront with people. That press conference last weekend was no light effort. He's told us the state's in a very precarious situation. My community's in a particularly difficult situation. If you look at the vaccination rates, it's the community I represent that's amongst the lowest in the state, lowest in the country, at 24% of eligible people fully vaccinated, as compared to the statewide total. So right now is not the time to be talking about letting the disease rip. We've seen the consequences in New South Wales.
Hang on, I'm just going to jump in there. I'm not talking about letting it rip, and a lot of people aren't. It's a middle ground between a very harsh lockdown and let it rip, which is smart restrictions that will reduce it going up exponentially, but allow people some semblance, whether it be businesses, people, children, something that's approaching a normal life.
Well, every day that progresses, every extra jab we can get in the arm, extra percent of vaccination that we can get in the population, does give governments further flexibility. And that's what we need to be focused on right now. We do not want to end up in the mess. I'm sorry to keep saying it, but that is what Victorians are saying. That's what we think. We look over the border and we do not want to end up like that, where the hospital system is overwhelmed.
I think a growing number perhaps are not keen to be in this lockdown until November. Anyway, we'll perhaps know a bit more in a couple of weeks.
No one's keen to be in this lockdown. No one is keen to be in this lockdown. Let's be very clear.
Julian Simmonds, Queensland's approach seems to be, let's just wait to see how New South Wales goes when it opens up. Is that fair enough?
Well, g'day, Tom. Look, I think Queensland's approach has to be to get more people vaccinated. It breaks my heart that my state is lagging behind in vaccine take-up and is leading the pack, some of the pack, in terms of vaccine hesitancy. And I think our CHO and our Queensland Premier have got a lot to answer for that, because they spent a lot of time talking down the vaccine, particularly AstraZeneca. So what we need here in Queensland need to do is to get more jabs in arms, and we need to hold all premiers accountable to the national plan they've signed up to, so that 70 and 80% is when we start to see our restrictions. Because, you see even Julian just before, the Labor Party want to have a bob each way on this. Lockdowns are good for now because they slow the spread of Delta. But anybody who says that they will keep Delta out forever is living in a fantasy land, quite frankly. They can slow it down until there's enough jabs in arms. But after that, we need to be able to live with COVID. And if we don't open up at 70 or 80%, then when? So if the Labor Party hedge their bets and say, we'll just follow Daniel Andrews and see what he says. Well, when then?
Part of the issue seems to be, states aren't saying, no matter what, on this 80%, here are all the things we'll do. we know New South Wales and ACT for a couple will be ahead of Queensland. So doesn't it make sense for the Queensland government to say, well, look, we'll see how that works, that timetable, before we lock ourselves into it. If there are issues with it and 85 is going to work better or whatever it might be, or including children, then we'll go down that path. Isn't that fair enough?
No, mate. Look, it's not 85 or something else. No, we've got the world's best health monitoring in the Doherty Institute, which says 70 and 80% is what our community needs
but there's that modelling, and soon we'll have a real-life example in New South Wales.
Well,
why wouldn't Queensland at least wait to see how that works?
But mate, I'm not against Queensland waiting until they get to 70 and 80%, right? And they'll make the board of decisions based on when they get to 70 and 80%. But if New South Wales get to 70 or 80% sooner, and they've been in 10 weeks of lockdown, I'm also not against people in New South Wales starting to enjoy some of the freedoms they should under those levels in the national plan.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about whether Queensland waits to see. Let me just ask you this quickly. What about Campbell Newman? He was applauding some of the lockdown protests over the weekend. Do you have some sympathy for the people here?
Well, no, actually, I think that I think people have a right to protest, but I'm really ashamed of how far Campbell Newman has fallen and how far he will go to snare a headline. I worked with him when he was Lord Mayor, but I'm also the parliamentary chair of the Law Enforcement Committee, and I know that there is never an excuse to assault police officers who are working for our community. So to see a protest where people are arrested for assaulting police officers, and then to see comments from Campbell Newman that he's applauding those protests, I think demonstrates that he's more after a headline than anything else.
Mate, that's great that you're condemning Campbell Newman. Are you going to go after Matt Canavan and Jared Rennick and George Christensen? Given you've gone after Campbell Newman, you're going to have a bit of consistency and go after your own government colleagues. You just accused Labor of undermining the vaccine rollout, and you've got these right-wing populist trolls sitting in your own party room in the parliament preaching misinformation. They're also at lockdown protests and cheering them on. Are you going to be consistent on this point? I put that back to every government member, you included.
Mate, the whole
Are you going to go after your own Queensland mates?
The whole parliament censured George Christensen for his debate, right? So
we've got Jared Rennick, Matt Canavan, Jared Rennick, Matt Canavan.
You guys have talked down the vaccine rollout the whole time. You couch it in language.
Mate, the only people talking down the vaccine rollout is your own government members.
Actually, to talk down the vaccine rollout. It's a shame, mate.
Labor has been absolutely consistent. We want jabs in arms. We want the vaccine rollout on track. You can't have a vaccine rollout if you don't have enough vaccines. That's the situation.
You won't even stick to the national.
I'm glad it seems to be getting better.
So inconsistent. You want to bob each way on this all of the time. It's see-through.
Well, we're right over time. We'll have to talk again next time, Julian and Julian.